We have to talk about Valve's supposed monopoly because the drama was kicked up to 11 over the last few days, with everyone arguing about whether or not Valve has a monopoly and whether or not it's bad for the industry at large. Gamers chimed in, developers spoke up, and even Tim Sweeney himself contributed to the discussion. Putting aside the word monopoly, which I think is a trigger word for a lot of people, I do think it was actually a productive discussion, and I felt like this was a good opportunity to talk about the past, the present, and the future of this situation. The discourse online centered around the overarching point that Valve does control a lot of the PC market share, and that for many developers the 30% fee feels arbitrary, like a tax that you just have to pay for existing. It can be a lot to ask for, especially to developers that are a long way off from breaking even. For them, it could be the difference between making ends meet and another month of paying for necessities on your credit card, whereas for Valve, it appears to be just a drop in the bucket. The question many gamers have though is, what is the alternative? Before I answer that though, it is worth mentioning that all of this discussion came about as a result of the drama around Unity. Hey everyone, I wanted to make a quick note here. News just broke that Epic is laying off 16% of their staff. I wrote this script and recorded the voiceover earlier this week before hearing of any of this news. I am extremely disappointed by this news. I do believe it only emphasizes some of the upcoming points I make in this video about game development being a very tenuous business. But in any case, I do hope those folks land on their feet. That's all I've got. Let's get back to the video. After Unity issued an open letter apology and walked back most of the particulars around their install fee, they said that developers could pay the lower of two options. Developers could either pay a runtime fee, which still sounds a little vague, or they can pay a 2.5% cut of their revenue. Whichever one of these is lower is the one that developers would cough up. Without getting too deep into the specifics, the 2.5% revenue share is less than Unreal's 5%, and all of this got developers to thinking about how many ways their money is getting split. It begins to look a lot like the entertainment industry, where you first pay your manager, then your agent, then your attorney, and finally after everyone's been paid, you're left with whatever you're left with. Here's one of the tweets that set it off. This person says, if game devs want to be mad at 5% from Epic or 2.5% from Unity, they need to first be mad at Steam. Steam eating 30% is unacceptable. If all developers used Epic Game Store, they'd have minimal or no fees in some cases. Steam would be forced to the table. Will it ever happen? This was followed up by the quote tweet that I think went most viral, if you will. This person, Sebastian, who is an engineer, said this: unpopular opinion, the gamers can blame themselves. In the past, many gamers vocally boycotted games that were not available on Steam. They wanted to be able to buy everything with their Steam account instead of logging to alternative systems. This created the PC games monopoly. Again, I want to set aside the word monopoly for this discussion. The point, I think, is that Steam controls an overwhelming amount of the PC gaming market share, and gamers are not only okay with this, but they would generally go as far as to support no Steam, no buy campaigns. But that brings me back to the original question I asked just a few minutes ago. What is the alternative? PC is already an open marketplace, and none of the other storefronts hold a candle to what Steam does. None of the other storefronts are as feature-rich or even as intuitive to use. Some storefronts do have unique benefits, like GOG and their commitment to selling DRM-free titles, or Itch.io and their open approach to virtually everything they do, or of course Game Pass and the Netflix-like subscription model that they have. But each of those feel like a side dish compared to the main course for almost all PC gamers: Steam. Gamers feel like Valve earns their 30% because of the way Valve supports customers and the way they provide a feature set that clearly required some amount of research and development to incorporate. In this way, it feels more like Valve takes their cut and reinvests it to benefit us, the consumers. Take this tweet from The Fox as an example. He says, Valve spent a decade working on Proton, GameScope, and Vulkan. Now, everyone's Steam library makes it easy to play on the Steam Deck, which is hardware that is heavily subsidized like a console. Not to mention all of the work in Steam VR. That 30% goes a long way. Carrie does make a good point here, that Valve is not simply taking a 30% cut for nothing, but that they are taking that 30% and at least some amount of that goes into long-term efforts that benefit consumers and arguably benefit gaming as a whole. There's a disconnect, however, because you could argue that gamers aren't the ones paying that 30%. If a game is $60 on Steam and it's $60 on the Epic Games Store, then that means a developer gets $42 for every copy sold on Steam, or nearly $53 for every copy sold on EGS. The developer makes 25% more on EGS and the consumer paid the same amount of money. Of course, the consumer might tell you that they did pay more to buy on EGS. They paid more, but it was indirectly because of the inconvenience of having to buy a game that is tied to a launcher that is objectively worse. But we'll return to that point later. The point is that the developer does feel this pain. It's once again 25% more money that could be going into their own pocket, and that's no small amount to scoff at when ultimately the games are what everyone is here for, and game development is a lot like opening a restaurant. Most people are not going to make it past the first year. The hard and disappointing truth is that for many people, game development remains a hobby, even for developers that are incredibly talented. Two Tribes was a company that was not only talented, but they had veteran experience. They were founded in 2001, and for a while they focused on portable games, with Tokitori first appearing on the Game Boy Color, adorable puzzle platforming that was a perfect fit for the adorable handheld. This eventually led to Tokitori coming to Steam in 2010, and it was a hit as far as indies on Steam in 2010 went. It currently sits at over 1,500 reviews, with nearly 90% of them being positive, but by 2016 they would release their final game called Rise. They said that they were dinosaurs and old farts, and how that's great on the one hand because they have plenty of experience, but it's also not so great on the other hand because of how they are slow and totally unaware of what is hot and what is not. For example, when it comes to marketing, they said, quote, "We know how to make a decent trailer and send out a press release, but have no clue on how to get traction on YouTube and Twitch," end quote. And there are thousands of stories just like this one of talented game developers that unfortunately can't rely on making video games as their sole source of income. The point isn't that these developers deserve pity. I'm just painting the picture that for many, game development is going to remain a hobby because there is incredibly little money to be made for the majority of folks. That's not Steam's fault, it's just the truth. I said in the opening that the number feels arbitrary, and perhaps in many ways it is. Putting Steam aside, most of the digital storefronts that we're aware of take a 30% share in revenue. Outside of the PC space, there are console storefronts like PlayStation, Nintendo, and Xbox, and all of those take 30%, not to mention mobile storefronts like Google Play and Apple's App Store. So you might ask yourself, why don't developers complain about those stores too? Well, they do. According to a State of the Industry survey conducted by the GDC, or Game Developers Conference, no more than 3% of respondents felt that the 30-70 split was justified. That was across all platforms, and it was down from the 6% who felt it was justified in the prior year. But again, where does the 30% come from? According to a paywalled article over on Bloomberg.com, the origins trace all the way back to cartridge fees as early as Nintendo's original console, the NES. Nintendo charged a 30% licensing fee to any third-party developers that wanted to publish their games on their console, with Namco and Hudson Soft being among the first. As a third-party developer, you couldn't bring any of your games to any competing systems, and you had to pass a rigorous certification to get the Nintendo seal of quality. In Nintendo's eyes, the cost was justified thanks to the proprietary cartridges that they supplied exclusively, as well as the certification that ensured customers could trust that the game being sold would meet a certain level of quality. This all notoriously led to Atari going rogue and releasing unlicensed NES games on their own black cartridges, and of course bypassing the Nintendo certification. Under their new imprint, Tengen, they released bootleg versions of Ms. Pac-Man, Tetris, Shinobi, and more. Eventually Nintendo sued them, and they were forced to cease the manufacturing of these carts. Since that time, licensing fees have been more varied, usually ranging between 10 to 20% for physical games. Competition drove the fee down, and even then it varied. You can imagine that when a console manufacturer had most of the market share like Sony and PS2, they probably leaned closer to the high end of that range, likely charging 20%. But if they were desperate and in need of games, like Microsoft and the original Xbox, they were likely willing to get closer to that 10% number. Competition in the market was healthy for developers, but it was also healthy for consumers. The reduced licensing fees meant that games could remain competitively priced. As we now complain about $70 games, many of you are quite aware that SNES games could get as high as $70 back in 1996, and sometimes higher than that. The fact that physical game prices didn't rise with inflation is tied to a few things, including the move to optical media, but it bears mentioning that the move to optical media was a direct result of the competition in the marketplace. I think we can all agree that Nintendo would have been content to keep publishing their games on proprietary cartridges that they had the legal right to charge a 30% royalty on, but competition kept everyone more honest, let's say. But then digital storefronts added a new wrinkle. All of a sudden, 30% returned to being the standard and everyone was alright with that. At the time, gamers still paid $60 for their games, retailers were guaranteed that games would be cheaper on digital storefronts, and none of the console manufacturers were keen on starting a race to the bottom. Everyone was satisfied. Steam, of course, launched in 2003, the Xbox 360 released in 2005, and the PS3 in 2006. And so the 30% standard stood unchallenged for nearly a decade and a half. But in the last couple of years, both Apple and Google have reduced their cut to 15% for the first $1 million in revenue. Of course, Epic themselves launched the Epic Game Store in 2018 with an aggressive 12% cut. And even more recently, they announced that developers can get their first 6 months with no revenue sharing whatsoever, so long as they keep their game exclusive to the EGS. Enter competition. This competition, however, has been greeted with resentment, at least on the PC front. Store exclusivity is seen as a bridge too far on a platform that is celebrated for its openness. Beyond that, PC gamers are skeptical of the so-called competition in the first place. Valve and even Gabe Newell are practically worshipped and seen as having saved the platform from near irrelevance. PC gaming was plagued with problems that made publishers unlikely to port their games over. Valve solved many of these problems with Steam. Ironically, they accomplished this by being more like consoles. They didn't take away from the openness of PC gaming, but they provided an easy path for those that wanted the convenience that traditionally was only provided by closed platforms. And like wolves being reintroduced to Yellowstone, the ecosystem slowly but surely became restored. Valve restored PC gaming when publishers were so quick to abandon it. Publishers didn't return until Valve courted us, the gamers, and so for lack of a better word, PC gamers have become loyal to Valve and not to the game developers that had once abandoned us. Moreover, as Eastern and Western publishers alike began to flock to PC gaming, the diehards knew that they would never have to deal with planned obsolescence in the form of new hardware again. Steam provided an opportunity to have a forever library. Even when the sanctity of open PC gaming was threatened by an impending draconian store developed by the very company whose operating system we all depended on to play said games, Valve spent years doing the impossible by decoupling the games in your library from the operating system they were originally designed for. So sure, we may stray from time to time and buy a game on a console or even GOG, but we knew that we would always come back home to our ride or die, Steam. And this is the standard to which the competition is held. Valve doesn't just enjoy first mover advantage, they've cultivated a loyalty that is unlike maybe anything I've ever seen in gaming, so much so that people begin to question long-standing principles. Many of these are people that are starkly against the death of physical games, but they also happen to have a Steam library that dwarfs their physical library. And sure, in a vacuum, they believe competition is good, but is competition so good when the only thing it will accomplish is diminish Valve's current power? Valve, the entity that is seen as a defender of PC gaming and the only real force moving it forward? Valve, who is seen not as a money-chasing business, but instead as a savior. And all of that is before I even get to the subject of how unsavory the competition can sometimes be. I am, of course, alluding to Epic. Here's a tweet from the developer of Dusk, Iron Lung, Squirrel Stapler, and more. This tweet, which went viral as well by the way, summarizes it neatly. He says, "I'd rather pay Valve 30% and put up with their de facto monopoly than help Epic work towards their own, very obviously desired, monopoly." In that thread, he goes on to say, Epic has raised numerous red flags over the years that they are a volatile, aggressive company who will turn whatever resources they have toward fighting genuine or perceived competitors, be it money, fans, or ideological support. Maybe they are ideologically motivated, maybe they are just good at disguising business moves as ideology. Neither is trustworthy in my opinion. Ideological business motivations are only so good as long as the ideology isn't toxic. He adds that he would love for Valve to have competition, but that he wouldn't, quote, want to replace the neutral entity I know for the devil I don't know, end quote. And this is around the time that Tim Sweeney, the CEO of Epic Games, chimes in. With regard to the commentary around ideological motivations, Tim says, "These are basic, non-political American principles I'm advocating for, such as free markets and fair competition, versus allowing monopolies in one market, like phones, to crush competitors in other markets, like stores and payments. These are principles we've held all along from the shareware days to the present, and argued for in all of our dealings with platform makers, in private where that was effective and in public where necessary. No strange ideology or isms here. If every developer and platform operates on a purely commercial calculus devoid of principle, then there's a bleak future ahead in which the powerful companies consume all the others and the fun of gaming and computing is lost. Advocating for principles works. The argument for cross-platform play ran from the early 2000s launch of Xbox Live to the Sony changes enabling Fortnite cross-platform in 2018. Now, all developers are free to support cross-platform play and social gaming is growing." Now, I wanted to present his full argument here because while I did squint at the use of non-political American principles, I do also believe that Tim made some good points. That is, if you assume that you can take these points at face value and believe that he's arguing in good faith. Going back to David, the developer of Dusk, he says out loud what many people seem to be thinking when he tweets, "Tim, I have immense respect for the work you've done over your career and what you've accomplished, but I simply do not believe those are the reasons behind the actions so much as they are convenient justifications for the actions. I, unfortunately, believe that your motivations have always been to take the place of Steam rather than to exist as a competitor. Steam is a lethargic, relatively benign monopoly. Epic is a volatile and aggressive company, and I believe would be similar as a monopoly." And that brings us all the way back to where we began. What is the alternative? In this video, I have refrained from giving my opinion up to this point, though many of you have heard previous videos where I have expressed at least a modicum of concern. First of all, I think above all else, Valve should in fact reduce their storefront share for small businesses just like Apple and Google has. To wit, I think Valve should adopt a 15% share for revenue under $1 million. That's going to reduce the burden on a lot of small-time developers, and it's honestly not going to break the bank for Valve, nor should it reduce their R&D investments. Taking the 80-20 rule into account, it is more than likely that Valve makes 80% of their revenue from the top 20% of their titles, so their purse shouldn't get hurt very much by this move. And yeah, maybe big game publishers did in fact abandon PC gamers once upon a time, but during that time, it was independent video game developers that kept Steam and PC gamers flush with unique experiences. And to this day, indie games remain some of my favorite titles. But aside from that, and speaking more selfishly, here is where my concern lies. I buy games on Steam almost exclusively. I have games on other platforms to be sure, but if I added up all the console games and all the non-Steam PC games I've ever bought, they likely wouldn't amount to half of what I own on Steam. It's not that I'm loyal to Steam, it's that it really is the path of least resistance. That should come as no surprise given that it's practically a founding principle of Steam. If Gabe Newell calls piracy a service problem and his aim was to curb piracy on PC, then it stands to reason that one of the primary goals of Steam was to be literally easier than piracy. And if you knew how easy piracy was in 2003, then you'd understand that that was a lofty goal. And so Steam is my forever library, but that leaves me with concerns. Many of my concerns stem from the fact that I think Valve's power will only grow. I'm of the belief that after 20 years of Steam, Valve is only just getting started. Steam Deck has destroyed the barrier between PC gaming and console gaming, and if you think Valve is going to stop there, well, I don't know why you're still watching this video, to be honest. And unfortunately, my fears aren't diminished with the belief that Gabe may likely pass his company down to his son, Great Newell. The future is uncertain, and I've already witnessed business inheritance go awry, like how the New York Knicks have been mishandled ever since CEO James Dolan took over for his father Charles. And not to mention, I've seen heroes live long enough to become the villain. But just like David Zemansky, I don't trust Epic to be any better, and just like many of you, I don't think they've done enough to earn my money. I'm not as adamant as many of you when it comes to the subject of PC exclusives, but the Epic Game Store has been around for 5 years now, and even with Epic's deep pockets, the store and the launcher are still incredibly bare when it comes to features. And even if I am fine with Epic Payola, I acknowledge that Epic needs to do a lot more than just buy exclusives to be considered competition to Steam. Valve didn't worry about the games, they cared about the consumer experience first, and the games came as a result of that. Hopefully others can do the same, and hopefully the entire ecosystem can become better for it. That gang out. Goodbye.